In Luke 22, the passage that David read just a little bit earlier, I just want to set up a little bit of background for that. Jesus is facing at that time a very difficult situation. He knows the things that are coming, that he's going to be facing persecution and torture and death. The disciples knew this too. He had spent that night teaching them about the fact that he was going to leave them. He would send the Comforter. He established the Lord's Supper and said, "Do this in remembrance of me," which, that has implications. But the disciples, doesn't it seem like sometimes they had a hard time getting it through their heads that Jesus was going to die? But that night, as he's facing that situation, the scriptures give us some incredible descriptions of the difficulty that Jesus was facing. Even before partaking of the supper together, the Passover supper together, we can read in John 12 and verse 27 that he tells his disciples, "Now is my soul troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I have come to this hour." He knew he had to face the death that was coming. But inside, in my soul, he said, my soul is troubled. It was a storm. It was difficult for him. We can read in Matthew, the 26th chapter, in verse 36, when they get to the Mount of Olives. And this is, of course, Matthew's version of the passage that we read in Luke. But at that time, he takes Peter and James and John with him, and it says he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he actually says to the disciples, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death." Have you ever been in that situation where you were sorrowful to the point of death? Where you were so struggling with the things that were coming up that you were obviously troubled. Mark follows a similar pattern of thought. In Mark, the 14th chapter, it says that he became greatly distressed and troubled. And then the same words are used there as in Matthew. "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death." What Jesus was facing was incredibly difficult. In Luke, the 22nd chapter, verse 44, in the midst of those prayers where he goes 3 times to pray, as he prepares for the second one, it says, "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." He was in agony. Excuse me. So he goes with the disciples to pray, and this is the situation that he is in. And what does he instruct the disciples to do? He says to them, "Pray that you enter not into temptation." Now, Luke is the one that records that. In both Mark and Matthew, Jesus tells them, "Remain here and watch." And watch has the idea of stay awake, be vigilant. So remain here with me, be vigilant and watch. And he tells the disciples, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." I find it a little interesting, don't you, that what he doesn't tell them is, "Please pray for me." I mean, with everything that's going on for him at that time, and the sorrow and the struggles that he's feeling, he doesn't say, "Look, I could really use your prayers." He doesn't say that. He's thinking of them. He says, "You pray that you don't enter into temptation." But isn't that how he always is, that he thinks of us first? That he considers what we're going through? But it's curious, what temptation were they to pray for? Were they going to be facing temptations on that hill that night? Would that night they be facing temptation? I'm not sure that they knew exactly what to pray for, but I think certainly Jesus did. In fact, he had warned them, hadn't he, that they would betray Jesus, that they would all run away. One, of course, Peter, denied him. they did struggle with his suffering and with his death. But I'm just so impressed that on this night when Jesus is so deeply troubled, he's still thinking of his disciples and the difficulties that they're going to face and wants them to prepare for it. When Jesus died, would that affect the disciples? Well, certainly it was going to affect them. And in part, it was going to affect them because many of the Jews, and Jesus had tried to teach the disciples this, but many of the Jews expected the Messiah, who they understood Jesus to be, to establish an earthly kingdom. And he would kick out the Romans, and they would be a great, glorious nation like during the time of King David. And having Jesus die presents a problem you can't overcome, as far as they understood it, in being able to fulfill their idea of the Messiah. They would be discouraged, wouldn't they, by his suffering and by his death? I don't think he wants them to lose hope in him. And in some ways, as much as they needed to prepare for the betrayal and the struggles that they would face in the opposition, they needed to be aware of the temptation of the discouragement and the loss of hope in Jesus also, that they did not lose faith in him. I love the fact, don't you, that even for a while Peter was willing to fight for him. You know, that really says something about Peter, doesn't it? We're going to save him. We're going to take care of him. But then what happens when he dies? What happens to all that promise? What happens to all that hope? And I think this is part of the temptation that he wanted them to pray for. They needed to be able to see the glory of Jesus through the gloom of his death. And let's not forget this, that when Jesus died, it was glorious. I know we're probably a little uncomfortable thinking about that, but he was doing that for us to save us from our sins. There's a glory to that that's just incredible. But sometimes we focus on the death and the darkness, and we forget to see that glory. So on that night, I think part of the temptation that they need to prepare for is dealing with his death. Jesus, we're told, goes off, it says a stone's throw, to pray and offer his prayers up to God. And after Jesus' instruction to them, what do? We reads that when he came back to them after the first time he was gone, they fell asleep. Can you imagine them falling asleep? What had he asked them to do? Remain with me, watch, stay awake, be vigilant, and pray. And they fell asleep. When Jesus comes back and talks to Peter about it, we read in Mark the 14th chapter, he asked Peter, could you not watch 1 hour? Now I know from the text, because Jesus' prayers is very short, in offering the prayer to God, Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. I think he prayed a little bit more than that during this time, don't you? That I don't think the disciples fell asleep that quickly. And so I don't know if Jesus means he was gone precisely 1 hour, but he was gone for a significant amount of time praying, and the disciples during that time had actually fallen asleep. In Mark the 14th chapter, when he talks about it, he tells them again, watch, after they had fallen asleep and he's about to go pray again, he says, watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And I think we all know what that means when it comes to some times like this, that sometimes it's easy for us, even in the midst of very special and great things that are happening, that sometimes we're sleepy and it becomes too much for us and our eyelids become heavy. In fact, Mark the 14th chapter, verse 40, that's the next time that he comes and sees them. It says their eyes were heavy. So Jesus comes to them again and finds them sleeping. Their eyes are heavy. And it says in Mark 14, verse 40, they did not know how to answer him. I mean, all of us understand that, right? Can't you just see their heads hanging? Kind of looking around, I can't believe we did it again. I can't believe we fell asleep. He's asked us to watch him pray, and we fell asleep again. Not just once. This is the second time. They were abashed, weren't they? They were ashamed of that. They had nothing to say to Jesus. He asked them to do something simple. Mark the 14th chapter, verse 41. He goes off to pray, and he comes back. He finds them asleep. Are you still sleeping, he says? Taking your rest? It's enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man's about to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. It is enough. What exactly does that mean? Matthew records it a little bit differently. Sleep and take your rest later on, Matthew says. The time will come when it's the right time to sleep. It's not right now. Let's go, because we're about to be betrayed. They had fallen asleep. Following Jesus is exhausting. I think sometimes, especially those of us who are preachers, we like to give you the idea that following Jesus is always joyful and loving, and it's hard work, but yeah, we can do it, and we become almost like cheerleaders. But you know what? Following Jesus can be exhausting. And that's what happened to the disciples here, isn't it? They had spent the day preparing for the Passover, partaking of the Passover, celebrating that great feast that God had established for them. But even during that, Jesus had continued to teach them. And did he teach them simple, easy things to understand? No, he was teaching them deep things and preparing them for what was about to happen. Difficult to understand. They were exhausted by the time that they had done all of those things and gotten up on that hill, and it was dark and it was quiet, and they were supposed to be praying, and guess what happened? They fell asleep. Have you ever fell asleep when you were supposed to be praying? I have. I realized a long, long time ago when I was a kid, that's kind of one of the things parents encourage their kids to do, right? Before you go to sleep, say a prayer to God. And so I don't know why. It wasn't my parents' fault. You won't hear that often. But it wasn't my parents' fault. It was my fault. But that kind of, in my mind, became, this is when I primarily pray. And so I would lay down in the bed and I would start to pray to God, and before I know it, I would wake up in the morning. I hadn't even hardly begun the prayer, and I fell asleep. I changed my praying habits because of that, because that was a recurring thing. And I learned that I need to do those kind of prayers when I'm much more alert. The disciples were exhausted. And they were exhausted in following Jesus, and this is the one who had said to them, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The great promise of rest, and here are his disciples so tired they can't stay awake to pray with Jesus when he's asked them to do that. Yes, we do have rest in Jesus. Don't ever mistake that. But that doesn't mean that we don't labor for him. And he is talking about taking a yoke, and yokes are made for working. We have work to do, and it's exhausting. Luke adds, though, in our text, that when he came, he found them sleeping. It's in verse 43. He found them sleeping for sorrow. And that really adds something to me about understanding what was going on with these disciples. That the reason that they were falling asleep, I don't think it was just that they were exhausted. I believe that's true. They were exhausted. But they were also sleeping for sorrow. why would they have this sorrow? Clearly they cared for Jesus. And they knew that the things that he was going through, that he was suffering, they may not have understood why he told them that he was deeply troubled and suffering and sorrowful. But they understood things were different. They had never seen Jesus like this. I don't think they had ever seen Jesus acting like he was that night. They'd seen him weeping with Mary and Martha when Lazarus, their brother and his friend, had died. They'd seen that. So they didn't think he was a robot. They understood that he had these emotions. They'd heard him rebuke the Pharisees. And after rebuking the Pharisees, he mourned for Jerusalem, for the things that were coming to come on the people, because they'd rejected him and rejected God. They knew he'd spent whole nights in prayer, alone by himself, but he had prayed with God. They knew all these things, but they'd never seen Jesus like he was this night. And I think they could perceive, maybe without really understanding why, but they could perceive that something profound was happening. And I still think they didn't really get it, but they knew he was sad, and so they were sad for him. And I find that really touching. And while they're sleeping, what is Jesus doing? Luke tells us in verse 44, being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. What a contrast between the disciples and Jesus. They keep falling asleep with heavy eyes and being full of sorrow. And isn't that just very human of us? Doesn't that sound just like us? He not only kept praying, he prayed harder, more earnestly. He kept praying, and he prayed more. I have a few thoughts that I want to share with you about this morning. And this is kind of a random thought lesson, okay? The first thought that I had as I studied this is, Jesus thinks of me. Just like he thought of the disciples, he thought of them first, even at this time. He thinks of me all the time. And he has a world to run and souls to save and things to do, but he thinks of me. Because he told the disciples, you pray that you don't enter into temptation. He was thinking of them. He knows what I'm going to face in my life, day by day and week by week. He knows that I need to pray. He knows I may be in sorrow. He knows I may be exhausted. But he thinks of me. And that cheers me. Doesn't it cheer you? That he thinks of you. And he urges me to pray for the things that I'm going to face. Prepare for the struggles of life with prayer. And he does that in an incredible way. I like the example that he gives even in the context here. Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. But not my will, but yours be done. And we often realize that's how we need to say our prayers also. Lord, this is the problem that I'm facing. This is what I would like, but I submit to your will. But we need to be reminded sometimes that in the midst of all the struggles that we face in life, we need to prepare for facing those temptations, those sorrows, everything. We need to prepare for it by prayer. We need to go to him and pray that we don't enter into temptation. The third thought is, he still loves me even when I fail. He had made pretty simple requests for the disciples, hadn't he? Remain with me, and I don't think he just meant stay in the same spot, right? He wanted them with him. Remain with me, watch, stay awake, and pray. But Peter, couldn't you pray for 1 hour? Couldn't you stay awake for just 1 hour? And the obvious answer to that for Peter would be what? No, Lord, I can't. He was exhausted and he fell asleep, and then he fell asleep again, and he fell asleep again. And they all did. The second time when he came back, they didn't know what to answer him. The third time, it's enough. Rest later. 3 times he found them sleeping. Sleeping when they really needed to be praying. He loved them anyway, though, didn't he? It's enough. Let's go. The next point is that Jesus knows of our weariness and our sorrows. Do you think he knew what they were going to be struggling with when he told them to pray? Of course he did. And this is what is so real to me about our relationship with God and about prayer. And the fact that sometimes I get tired. And that affects my service to God. And sometimes when we're too tired, we fall asleep when we should be praying. Sometimes when we're sad, we fail to be diligent in our labors. When we're struggling, he knows that we're struggling. And I think on those words that Jesus said to them, it is enough. Take your rest later on. Let's go. When I was younger, I know that I read that as if it was a rebuke. It is enough. I have put up with you guys. Now I don't read it that same way. It's enough. You did what you could. Yes, you fell asleep, but you were weary and sorrowful. It's enough. Take your rest later and let's go. Now I hear understanding and love and compassion. Disappointment? Probably, yeah. I still hear disappointment. I mean, how can you not hear disappointment when someone says it's enough? Yes, he was disappointed, but he knows that we're struggling with these things. Pray that you enter not into temptation. And Jesus tells me I need to pray more earnestly. I need to pray harder. I love how the Hebrew writer talks about Jesus' prayer that night, at least in part that night, in the book of Hebrews, the 5th chapter, and verses 7 and 8. He gives us this insight into Jesus' prayer that night. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplication with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Do you see Jesus' prayer at this time? It says that he offered it with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him. I remember when I was younger that seeing in those old Bibles, they had those pictures. And the picture they had of Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, there was always a big rock, and he was on his knees, and he was, hands were bowed, and he was looking up into heaven, and the light was shining down on him. And there was not really a smile on his face. I don't think they were that bold, but he was there praying. That picture's all wrong. It's completely wrong. If you go and read the text, he was down on the ground, laying down flat. This passage tells us that his prayer, it wasn't one of serenity when he was saying, "Thy will be done," or "Let this cup pass from me." It says, with loud cries and with tears. He was in agony, and the sweat drops like blood. Pray harder. We're often told we need to pray constantly, right? I mean, it's 1 Thessalonians 5, right? Pray continually. Pray without ceasing. We need to be people who pray. But sometimes we need to not just pray, but we need to pray harder, more earnestly. Not formulas, not just our normal prayers. We need to pray harder. In the book of Jonah, the second chapter of Jonah, and you remember the story of Jonah, he's the prophet that was told by God to go to Nineveh and preach to those people and tell them that he was coming in judgment. And Jonah said, essentially, he wasn't going to do that, and he tried to run away from God, and he got on a ship to go to sea to the furthest place he could get away from God from. And during that time, a storm arose, and God was the cause of the storm, and the people in the ship did everything that they could to save the ship, and they finally said, okay, who made their God angry? And Jonah says, it was me, and they threw him overboard. The second chapter of the book of Jonah is his prayer. And in that prayer, we get the prayer from the belly of the fish, and we also get hints of his prayer when he was drowning. Let me ask you a question. When Jonah was in that water and descending to the bottom of the sea, where it says that the weeds were wrapping around his body, to hold him down, he couldn't get out. How hard was he praying? Do you think that was different from Jonah's normal prayer? Because I do. I think he was praying like he had never prayed before. And I think even in the belly of the fish, I would have been praying pretty hard. Don't you? We need to learn to pray harder when we're facing difficult times. And what I love about this, the reason that we need to do that, go back to what it says about Jesus when he was praying in Hebrews 5. It says that he offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. God heard his prayers. He still suffered and he still died, but God heard his prayers. Why is it that we need to pray harder? Because we know our God hears our prayers, and he's going to do what's best and what's right for us. So pray harder. Pray harder. It's okay to pray for me. Maybe this is, again, one of those childish things. When we were taught how to pray, always the very last thing was, pray for yourself. We were given a list of things to pray for, right? Always the last was yourself. And there was always a part of me that kind of felt kind of guilty even doing that. But isn't that what Jesus did for the disciples? He encouraged them to pray for themselves. Pray that you enter not into temptation. We need to be careful about having a kind of false humility about praying too much for ourselves. We need to be praying for ourselves. And sometimes we need to pray really hard for ourselves. Like Jesus, we're going to keep the will of God first and foremost in our minds, that his will be done. But isn't this the model prayer? Give us this day our daily bread. That's about, I need food to eat. And forgive us. Don't lead us into temptation. When the disciples on that night had been asked by Jesus to remain and watch and pray, and they were tired and sorrowful, they needed to be praying for themselves. But they fell asleep. But it's okay to pray for me. And the last point I want to make is this. Like Jesus, I need to encourage other people to pray to God too. That's for all of us, not just me. We all need to be encouraging each other to pray. And even when I'm in the midst of, like Jesus was, if I'm in a hard times myself, if I'm struggling and facing difficulties, it's really helpful for me if I point others to Jesus, say, spend some time in prayer. Point others to him so that they can find help, so that they remain with Jesus and stay awake and pray when they need to. So I guess really the whole point of this lesson is pray. I don't know if you got that point. Whatever you're facing this week, prepare with prayer. Maybe set some time this afternoon and prepare for the week to come with prayer. And then pray harder. And pray for yourself. And talk to God about the fact that you might fail, that you might be tempted, that you might be struggling. Pray to Him about all these things. And help others to pray also. Let's encourage each other in that. We need to be known as a people who pray. Pray. We want to offer an invitation this morning to anyone here. If you're not a child of God, if you believe that Jesus is the Christ, because you believe you're ready to repent of your sins, be baptized, and have your sins washed away. Would you please come forward as we stand and sing?